There is an oncoming economic disaster and possibly even a risk of world war that you need to know about. Check this out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and please subscribe to our channel. There are a few trends. I mean, this is kind of the noise that's around everything, but there are a few trends I think that we really need to be paying attention to right now because we have seen this movie before. We saw this movie back in the 1920s and 1930s. We are facing a couple of things that are, almost direct repeats of this. First of all, we're seeing the rise of a new and brutal form of governance with extraordinary industrial capacity and power. This is China. The last time we saw this, the rise of an industrial power that was also essentially fascistic was Nazi Germany, the rise of Nazi Germany in the 1930s in Germany, in Europe. And, of course, that went on to cause World War II, in part. We're seeing the exhaustion of monetary policies. In the United States, we have interest rates that are just a little over 1%. In Europe, in some cases, they're even below zero. And in and of itself, if you just look at that in a little cube and say, oh, interesting, look at that, it doesn't seem to be all that meaningful. But if you look at it in the larger context, which is that the principal way that governments can stimulate an economy when the economy goes in the tank because of the cyclical nature of capitalism, when an economy goes in the tank, the principal way that a government can stimulate it out of recession or depression is by lowering interest rates. And the last time our government was using low interest rates to solve a problem like this, it was the Great Depression. Interest rates went down to close to zero, but they're close to zero now. And yet we're having an expanding economy and an expanding and an increasing stock market. Excuse me. So the problem here with that is that if there is a financial crisis and or even just a downturn, there's no way to use monetary policy, to use interest rates to get us out of that. The other thing, the other tool, the other weapon, by the way, that central banks have is pouring money into the economy by buying bonds out of the marketplace and injecting that money into the economy as a whole, thereby. And we've been doing that for 10 years. It was called QE, quantitative easing. They're not calling it that anymore, but they're doing the same thing, and they had to start doing it on an emergency basis with the repo market a few months ago. So at the same time that we're seeing the rise of China invoking the possibility of the Thucydides trap, the Greek philosopher who pointed out that war is most likely to happen when an established power, we have a unipolar world. The United States basically ruled the world from the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s and the first decade of the 2000s, to now where China's economy is going to be larger than ours any day now, might be already. And their middle class is now 3 times the size of ours. And it's just like, okay, so that's the Thucydides trap. That's a potential war point. Another one of the 4 things that we need to be looking at is that inequality and poverty in the United States are back to levels that they were in the 1920s, during the Roaring '20s, which led, again, straight to the stock market crash of 1929. The last time we saw this was 1929, this level of inequality. And then finally, we're seeing massive amounts of both government and corporate debt and individual debt. And, the reason for that is the low interest rates. It's just very simple, right? When money is cheap, people buy it, or rent it, which is, what you do when you borrow money. You're renting money. And if the cost to rent money is 5, 6, 7%, normal interest rates, or even 3 or 4%, if you're running a business and you're looking at that and you're saying, okay, I can use this money for one of two things, basically. I can borrow money and use it to increase the value of my stocks, or the price of my stocks. It doesn't increase the value. I can use it to increase the price of my stocks by buying shares back out of the marketplace and retiring them. And thus, the number of shares in circulation goes down, so the price goes up. I could do that, or I could take this money and I could invest it in new products or new services or expansion or R&D. In a world where interest rates are 3, 4, 5%, you have to know that your stock price is going to go up more than 6 or 7% in order to be able to pay back that debt. Or that the product you're going to produce is going to have to produce a profit of 6 or 7 or 8%. It's got to be above the cost of borrowing money. But when you can borrow money for free, as in Europe, or when you can borrow money for 1%, as in the United States, you only have to show a 2% profit or a 3% profit, which is the riskier investment strategy. So companies have been, they're literally buying back trillions of dollars worth of their own shares right now. And they're not investing this money in R&D because it's, the fastest return on your investment is simply to buy the stock in your own company, at least from the point of view of the CEOs and all the senior executives who are principally paid with stock. Something that was illegal before the Reagan presidency, by the way, and should be again, because this, paying executives with stock causes them to make decisions based on what's going to increase stock price, not what's best for the company or what's best for the economy or what's best for the community or what's, it's just a complete, it's called a perverse incentive. So as these variables all rush together, what we have right now are the seeds of a possible Second Great Depression and Third World War. And, to navigate times like this, we really need smart people in our political system. But because in the 1970s, the Supreme Court legalized political bribery and said billionaires and big corporations can own as many politicians as they want, no limits, all good. Instead, what we have are shills running our politics. Just very simply. And idiots. And yeah, the law is catching up with them here and there, but so I'm seeing all these things, all these mistakes that we're making that are virtual clones of what we did in the 1920s and early 1930s. And it's just jaw-dropping, basically. The CEOs are basically running a Ponzi scheme, with the share buybacks. And it's been going on for years now. Clearly, we need somebody in the White House who understands this stuff. And who will put this genie back in the bottle before this, to torture the metaphor, before this genie, blows up our country, or our world. There's some really very, very serious issues here. And I think we need to be taking them very seriously. But instead we have now, again, this, here to extend it even further, another trap, another problem, another danger area. Instead of having a media which explains to people what's going on, go back and read the New York Times from the 1930s. They laid out, what the policies were, who the politicians were, what was going on. Now, well, yeah, the Times and the Post do a pretty good job of reporting the news. But most of the news, our local newspaper, USA Today, obviously talk radio, people are getting very little news. They're getting human interest stories, and they're getting wall-to-wall coverage of Donald Trump, and if it leads, it bleeds kind of stuff. But, we're really not hearing what's going on. We used to have laws in place that guaranteed local ownership of media, radio, television, and newspapers, which, led to a sense of responsibility on the part of the owners for their community. I get the newspaper that we get here in Oregon is owned by a company in New York. How crazy is that? So all of these are the result of, we had this situation in the 20s. It crashed our economy and led to a world war. Franklin Roosevelt laid out the causes of the problem and fixed them with a whole bunch of things, from the fairness doctrine to local ownership rules to the way that the Fed would operate, to restricting, making it illegal for corporations to pay their senior executives with stock. Just basic common sense regulations, separating investment banks, the Glass-Steagall Act, separating investment banks from checkbook banks. In other words, so that banks would not gamble with the money that you have in your savings account. And every single one of those things has been blown up, largely by Republicans, although in many cases with enthusiastic complicity from Democrats, who are in some cases also, big, because the Supreme Court legalized this in the 1970s, who are also taking big money from the big banks, and so they're voting to to blow up Glass-Steagall, for example. And so the question, I guess, is, how do we stop this? Or will it take another crash to stop this? Arnold Toynbee is said to have said, when the last man who remembers the horrors of the last great war dies, the next great war becomes inevitable. Well, the people who remember what it was like in the 1920s that created the Great Depression of the 1930s are pretty much all dead. In fact, those who were adults in the 1920s are all dead. And so where are the voices? They're only coming from our historians and a few economists, like Paul Krugman.